Have you ever woken up with a strange ache in your leg and thought, eh, I'm probably just getting older? Most of us brush these little things off until they grow into something we can't ignore. But imagine living in a time where medical care was brutal, your diet was 90% meat and alcohol, and nobody dared tell you the truth because you were the king. Now picture this. You are that king, and your body is falling apart faster than anyone can help you. Your skin splits open when you walk. Your wounds ooze through silk stockings. Your servants cry from the smell when they enter your room. And worst of all, you're still the most powerful man in the country. Welcome to the truly grotesque story of the king who rotted alive. This isn't your typical history lesson. No polished portraits or textbook summaries. This is the real-life horror tale of a monarch whose body betrayed him in slow, agonizing stages, while his nation looked on in horror. A ruler so bloated, broken, and diseased that his own coffin couldn't contain him. Literally. In this video, we're going to stagger through the haunting transformation of a once powerful king into a walking corpse. We'll uncover the medical theories, the tragic missteps, and the absolute refusal to admit something was deeply wrong. Not just physically, but mentally too. So let's start with what you might feel right now: fatigue. That sluggish, hard to pin down sense that your body just doesn't work like it used to. It sneaks in quietly, but in the case of this king, it arrived with such violence and decay that it couldn't be ignored. He wasn't always this way. In fact, when he was younger, he was the picture of power and athleticism. Broad-shouldered, charismatic, a skilled jouster who commanded both admiration and fear. But that image, like all images, was temporary. A single accident changed everything. During a tournament in 1536, the king was knocked from his horse in a devastating jousting accident. He lay unconscious for hours. At a time when medical knowledge was about as useful as a bucket with holes, this wasn't just dangerous, it was a death sentence in slow motion. Modern experts suspect he suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. But back then, no one dared say it aloud. To suggest the king was mentally unfit was to sign your own death warrant. And from that moment forward, something broke. Not just in his body, but in his mind. His moods darkened. His anger grew unpredictable. He developed rages so violent his courtiers feared even entering the same room. The man who once danced and hunted now limped with pain, his face bloated, his legs wrapped in bandages soaked through with fluid that no one dared describe in detail. The injury also left him with chronic ulcers on his legs, wounds so foul, so infected, that people in the palace would know when the king was near simply by the stench. His body had become a mobile warning sign. Servants begged to be excused from duties that required entering his chamber. Doctors applied primitive salves and dressings that did little more than delay the inevitable. But no one, not a soul, would tell him the truth. Why? Because this king was not just ill, he was feared. His word was law. And criticizing the health of a man who believed he ruled by divine right was treason. So instead they watched. They watched his body swell to impossible proportions. They watched his leg wounds deepen and blacken. They watched him eat, drink, and bellow orders while quietly rotting from the inside out. But let's take a moment here. Imagine being in his shoes. Not the ones with golden buckles and ermine lining, but the real shoes. The ones filled with bloody bandages, excruciating pressure, and the constant unbearable knowledge that something inside you is dying. And you can't stop it. You can't admit it. You can't even speak of it because you're the king. This brings us to something very human: denial. A deeply relatable thing. Whether you're avoiding a doctor's appointment, ignoring that weird pain in your shoulder, or pretending that stress isn't eating you alive, denial can feel safer than truth. Even kings fall into it, especially kings. But here's the cost. Denial, when married to absolute power, becomes a monster. This king's refusal to confront his own condition didn't just cost him comfort, it cost him sanity. He lashed out at friends, executed advisors, pushed away family. The paranoia wasn't just imagined. It was a product of that untreated, festering wound in both body and mind. And as the physical decay progressed, the coping mechanisms grew stranger. His meals grew bigger, as if food could fill the hollowing space inside him. His beds were surrounded by weapons, his corridors redesigned with secret escape passages. He even demanded that his meals be taste tested by multiple servants and then left untouched for 30 minutes, just in case the poison was slow acting. He feared assassination, but his greatest threat was his own body. And still, no one said a word. This is what makes the story so disturbing. Not just the horror of the disease or the grotesque symptoms, but the silence that surrounded it. The court became a stage, a theater of fear, where everyone played along as if everything was fine. Perfumed handkerchiefs were held discreetly to the nose. Conversations happened with heads bowed low. No one mentioned the blood on the carpets or the rot in the king's boots. And yet, history tends to remember this man for his decisions, not for his condition. For his power, not his pain. But if we look closer, we can see that everything, the cruelty, the rash laws, the reckless marriages, stemmed from one unspoken truth. This was a man who was dying from the inside out, and he knew it. Not all at once, slowly, day by day, ulcer by ulcer, pound by pound. And now that you've seen what can happen when a man refuses to face his decline, let's look at what it meant for the people around him. Because when a king rots, it's never a private affair. It poisons the court, it taints the laws, it touches everyone. Let's keep going. Now that we've entered the twisted inner world of a king who refused to face his own decay, let's take a step deeper into the ripple effects. Because when a man with absolute power begins to fall apart, his empire doesn't stay intact. The walls start to crack, not from outside enemies, but from within. And everyone, wives, friends, servants, even his own children, gets caught in the fallout. Let's talk about his marriages. 6 of them, if you're counting. But the number barely scratches the surface of what really happened behind those royal bedroom doors. To the public, these were grand unions, political alliances, or in some cases, matters of national survival. But in reality, these women were pawns in a game ruled by a man whose body was rotting and whose mind was rotting faster. The palace walls weren't gilded dreams. They were silent prisons. And behind those curtains, the psychological games were as disturbing as the physical ones. Take Anne Boleyn, the queen whose name has been immortalized in history books, TV dramas, and tragic love ballads. But let's cut through the romance. Anne didn't just fall out of favor. She was fed to the wolves. Orchestrated rumors, forced confessions, public humiliations. Henry didn't simply remove her. He made her watch the destruction of everyone around her first. Men who were once allies, even her own brother, paraded to their deaths as she waited for the sword. It wasn't punishment. It was psychological warfare. This is a man who bathed in paranoia, who could no longer trust his body, and therefore trusted no one. What's truly chilling is that many historians now believe these betrayals weren't real at all. They were hallucinations of betrayal, born from a toxic brew of untreated trauma, infection-driven delusion, and unchecked power. His later wife, Catherine Howard, was a teenager when he married her, a girl, barely into adulthood, suddenly made queen of a kingdom, and prisoner to a man with blood on his hands and rot in his veins. When he found out she had once had a lover before him, he didn't just execute her. He rewrote the law. He made it treason for anyone to withhold their sexual history before marrying the king. Think about that. Not just the punishment, but the pettiness of it. A legal system reshaped because a dying man needed control. Because the one thing he couldn't command, his body, had turned him into a man who needed to control everything else. It's easy to look back and shake our heads, but let's pause here for a moment of reflection. We've all, in some way, tried to overcompensate for the things we can't fix. When we feel out of control, physically, emotionally, it's tempting to grip tightly onto something, anything, just to feel powerful again. For most of us, it's something small, micromanaging a task, lashing out during a bad day. For a king, it was rewriting reality with ink and blade. But what makes this story even darker is how the people around him responded. Not with resistance, not with revolution, but with terrified compliance. The palace became a stage where everyone acted like everything was fine. Ministers, nobles, wives. They played their parts because deviating from the script meant death. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of his reign, the way fear hollowed out the people closest to him. Servants, once proud to work for the royal household, were now drawing straws just to see who had to help dress the king. Not because of duty, but because of the smell, the open wounds, the leaking flesh. You see, by the final years of his life, Henry VIII's leg ulcers had grown so deep and infected that pieces of his flesh would stick to his bandages. Taking them off meant peeling his body apart, piece by piece. And someone had to do it. The royal physician, who should have had the courage to speak truth, said nothing. He knew that treating the king meant lying to him, telling him he looked strong, that he was healing, that his body, ravaged as it was not falling apart in front of them all. To do otherwise? Treason. And in Henry's world, treason didn't need proof. It just needed a whisper. And so the court began to rot too. Not physically, but morally. The very walls of power once upheld by council and nobility were now ruled by whispers and terror. Spies were everywhere, and not just the political kind. Henry had spies watching his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. These were his children, but he saw them not as heirs, not as girls, but as possible threats, possible traitors. Imagine being a teenager and knowing your father, the king, had people recording your conversations, watching your letters, judging your every move. Not because you had done anything wrong, but because your father no longer knew what was real. Paranoia had become his reality. But the most terrifying part? His paranoia made others paranoid too. Nobles began to spy on one another to protect themselves. Servants betrayed each other over scraps of favor. Even the cooks, those who prepared the king's extravagant, grotesquely excessive meals, worked under constant watch. Every spice measured, every wine bottle tested, every crumb inspected for poison, even as his own body was poisoning him from within. He had hundreds of staff, and yet he was utterly alone. He had a kingdom, and yet he was imprisoned by his own fear. This wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the slow-motion collapse of an empire built around one rotting, terrified, uncontrollable human being. You see, when power is absolute, it doesn't just isolate. It distorts, it deforms, It convinces the powerful that they are invincible even as they fall apart, and it convinces everyone around them to lie about it. And as Henry sat on his throne, bloated with meat, surrounded by silence, fanned by terrified servants who dared not breathe too loudly, his country suffered for it. Not with revolution, not with rebellion, but with something worse, slow, quiet decay, just like the king himself. So now we come to the end, or rather, what should have been the end. Because in most stories, when the tyrant dies, the kingdom breathes a sigh of relief. The candles are lit, the mourning is short, and history turns a new page. But with this king, the one who rotted alive, death was not the final curtain. It was merely the start of the encore. Let's talk about the last days. The grotesque, unforgettable finale of a man who refused to accept mortality until his own flesh began to fall off the bone. By this point, Henry VIII, though never named outright in this tale until now, was almost completely immobile. His once grand body had ballooned beyond recognition. His legs were wrapped in pus-soaked bandages, and open ulcers festered so deeply that even his doctors feared touching him. The king, once a living symbol of power and divine right, had become a sack of groaning flesh that had to be hauled around on specially designed chairs fitted with wheels and pulleys like a grotesque royal dolly. And then came the smell. There are no elegant words here. His flesh was decaying, actively, in real time. Every movement released more of the stench. You could smell the king beside him, no metaphor. That was the reality. The palace floors had to be cleaned constantly, because pieces of the king would fall off as they moved him. And still, no one dared speak the truth. It wasn't just dignity that was gone. It was the line between man and corpse. He hadn't officially died yet, but in many ways, Henry's body had already crossed into death while his mind still lingered behind, barking orders, demanding loyalty, insisting that he was still in command. But nature does not bow to power, no matter how many titles a man has. And when death finally came, it did not arrive gently. They say the moment of his passing was so grotesque that even those accustomed to medieval horror couldn't stomach it. His swollen, gas-filled body, wrapped hastily in lead sheets, began to rupture. The skin cracked. The gases built up. And as he lay inside his overstuffed coffin, the pressure became too much. Then, in an explosion so foul it halted an entire funeral procession, the coffin burst. Yes, you heard that right. The king's corpse detonated. The lead lining cracked open, and his decomposing remains spilled onto the floor of the hearse in a fetid stew of royal rot. The smell was unbearable. The sound? A sickening, wet pop. And the aftermath? Unspeakable. Servants scrambled with buckets, rags, and cloths, trying to collect the pieces of the man who had ruled them in terror. And here's a detail that feels like something out of a horror movie. But yes, it's recorded. Dogs were seen licking up the royal remains that had spilled onto the road. The man who ruled by divine right had become street food for scavenging strays. But it didn't stop there. Even his burial was a disaster. His tomb had to be dug extra wide just to fit the bloated coffin. But the ground kept collapsing, unable to support the weight of all that decaying meat wrapped in layers of metal and wood. It took multiple attempts, failed efforts, to bury what remained of the king. And even when the tomb was finally sealed, peace didn't follow. For years after, people swore they heard strange noises near the site. A low groaning, a foul odor. Some claimed it was his ghost. Others, more grounded in reality, suspected it was simply the gases, still building, still escaping, from the king's ever-rotting corpse. Even in death, he made his presence known. Even in death, he could not rest quietly. And perhaps that's the truest part of the story. Because this wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of denial, the final punishment for a life lived in refusal. He refused to be told the truth, refused to believe he was mortal, refused to accept his limits, his weakness, his pain. And so, in the end, his body told the truth louder than anyone else dared to. Here's the thing. History likes to dress these men up. Kings and emperors are often remembered in polished portraits with soft lighting and embroidered robes. But peel back the canvas, and what you find is often uglier, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Because power, when left unchecked, festers just like a wound. And the more we pretend not to notice, the worse it gets. This king, Henry VIII, wasn't just a tyrant. He was a mirror, a reminder of what happens when fear silences truth, when pride overrules reality, when denial becomes the law of the land. But don't mistake this story as just historical gossip, because while we may never sit on a throne, the lesson still hits close to home. We all ignore things we shouldn't. The pain in our knees, the stress that keeps us up at night, the relationships we know are toxic, but we're too tired to face. And sometimes, like this king, we bury the truth so deeply that it erupts violently when we least expect it. But here's the good news. You're not a monarch surrounded by sycophants. You don't need an army of servants to tell you what's real. You have the power to face your decay, physical or emotional, before it becomes a disaster, before it turns into something that explodes at your funeral. So take the story for what it is. Part horror, part history, part wake-up call. Let the rot of a dead king remind you to stay honest with yourself. Let his stench be a lesson that silence isn't strength, it's surrender. And if this tale of royal decay made you think twice about the stories we're told, then you've already taken the first step towards seeing history and yourself a little more clearly. If you found this as eye-opening as we did, go ahead and leave your thoughts below. What part shocked you the most? Drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and join us for more dark history that school books refuse to teach. Because sometimes the truth really is worse than fiction. Here's to truth, even when it stinks.